Today's material is a passionately argued script contending that mainstream Israeli media, specifically channels 12 and 13, are manufacturing a false narrative of settler violence to unfairly blame 500,000 Jewish citizens while ignoring actual Palestinian terrorism. It has immense energy, but we are diving straight into how to structurally fortify this argument for maximum impact, starting with the tone.
Right, because relying primarily on emotionally charged rhetoric limits the argument's ability to persuade a skeptical or neutral audience.
Yeah, exactly. The notes show the argument heavily utilizes phrases like cheap, dangerous consciousness engineering and hypocrisy.
And it describes the media's framing as a delusion. Yeah.
Right. And relying heavily on these labels is like serving a really spicy dish. It thrills the people who already love heat, but it might immediately alienate a neutral food critic. Like, are we prioritizing the rallying cry over the meticulous dismantling of the opponent's case?
Well, the weakness here is that the source material leans heavily on powerful accusatory adjectives to condemn the media's behavior, but it lacks a sustained analytical breakdown of the media's methods to definitively prove that bias to someone who doesn't already agree.
I mean, I get that from a structural standpoint, but when a writer feels a deep sense of injustice, removing the emotional language can feel like diluting the truth, you know?
Oh, sure.
If we strip away words like delusion or hypocrisy, how does the writer maintain the intensity of their argument without sounding completely detached?
Well, the suggestion is that you don't necessarily strip the emotion away entirely. Rather, you shift a portion of that emotional weight into methodical, data-driven comparisons.
Okay, so
You allow the evidence to naturally generate the outrage, rather than demanding the audience feel it up front, based purely on the narrator's tone.
Walk me through what that looks like in practice. Like, how do we take a massive, abstract claim like consciousness engineering and turn it into a data-driven comparison?
So instead of just, stating that channels 12 and 13 push a false narrative, you physically quantify the contrast. As a concrete example, add a section detailing the exact minutes of airtime dedicated to a price tag graffiti incident, which is fundamentally a crime of property damage,
Right.
versus the airtime dedicated to the 9 weekend terror attacks and the tragic loss of the 2 soldiers mentioned in the text.
Wait, but if I put a literal stopwatch on the screen to count the minutes of airtime, does that risk ruining the pacing of a fast-moving video essay? I mean, we want this to be engaging, not a math lecture.
It actually creates incredible visual tension if executed correctly. You don't have to make the viewer sit in silence for 3 minutes.
Oh, sure.
You can speed up the footage, show a rapidly spinning clock overlay, and visually stack the clips of the property damage coverage until they fill the screen.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And then contrast it with a tiny blinking red dot representing the 45 seconds given to a fatal attack. You are showing them the architecture of the media's priorities.
That makes the bias physical. The viewer can literally see the disproportionate weight.
what about the language the media uses, though? The script claims the media is engineering consciousness, which implies a very subtle manipulation of words.
Exactly. And that leads to a second concrete example. Take a specific headline from Channel 13 shown in the video and do a line-by-line clinical dissection of its vocabulary. Show exactly how the terminology subtly manipulates the viewer. You move from a mere assertion of bias to an undeniable demonstration of it.
Let's do a mock version of that right now so we can hear the mechanics of it. If I'm the writer looking at a Channel 13 headline, what exactly am I looking for to prove manipulation?
You are looking for the active versus passive voice, and you are looking for who is designated as the subject versus the object.
Okay.
For instance, if a headline says clashes leave 3 dead, that is passive. Clashes is a sterile noun that implies 2 equally responsible parties spontaneously colliding. It removes the aggressor from the sentence entirely.
Ah, I see. So if the media uses passive framing for one demographic, but uses hyperactive accusatory framing for another, saying something like, settlers attack village, that is the consciousness engineering happening in real time.
Precisely. If you pause the video, highlight the verbs, and explicitly point out to the audience, notice how the perpetrator vanishes in this headline, but is front and center in this other headline. You are giving the viewer an analytical tool.
Right. And when the audience sees the grammatical choices the media makes, the outrage they feel is their own, generated organically by the facts.
Exactly.
So if we are effectively swapping out emotional rhetoric for clinical, undeniable evidence, that forces a transition in how we handle the rest of the material. Because if we're relying on facts over feelings,
We must address the most inconvenient facts head on.
Right. The script makes a core claim that settler violence is a complete fabrication, but simultaneously, there's a brief caveat buried in the text where the writer says, if there is violence in Judea and Samaria, it needs to be treated. By categorically calling the opposition's narrative a lie, but briefly admitting violence does exist and needs treating, does the writer leave a trapdoor open? Doesn't this allow a critic to point to a single violent incident and say, see? You're denying reality?
Well, a completely dismissive approach to the opposition's core claims creates a vulnerability that threatens the credibility of the central argument.
Yeah, it does.
The weakness here is that the script categorically labels the idea of settler violence as a false narrative, which creates a slight logical contradiction when it later acknowledges that instances of violence must be handled.
Right.
This lack of nuance leaves an opening for critics to dismiss the entire video by pointing to real, albeit cited, events that the script hasn't adequately accounted for.
Writers often resist giving any ground on this issue, though. There is a psychological fear that if you admit even one person out of 500,000 threw a stone, you are somehow validating the opposing network's entire broadcast.
Sure, that's a common fear.
So how does a writer acknowledge reality without accidentally endorsing the false narrative they are trying to destroy?
You proactively address and contextualize the opposing claims using the technique of steel manning. You acknowledge the strongest form of the opposition's argument before methodically dismantling its scale and application.
Okay, so stop hiding the caveat.
Exactly. The suggestion is to bring it to the forefront, controlling the context around it.
What is the specific wording to execute that without, sounding defensive?
You insert a framing sentence that explicitly separates the fringe from the majority. As a concrete example, you could write, while any instance of individuals breaking the law is unacceptable and must be prosecuted, the media takes the actions of a microscopic fraction and maliciously applies it to 500,000 law-abiding citizens.
Oh, wow. That framing completely neutralizes the trapdoor. It's almost like administering a vaccine to the script.
Yeah.
You introduce a tiny, controlled dose of the counter-argument. Yes, isolated violence exists, in order to build immunity against it. If you have a city of 500,000 people anywhere in the world, statistically, you are going to have a fraction of a percent who commit crimes.
Right.
So by owning that demographic reality, the writer takes the weapon right out of the critic's hand.
And you can push that steel manning technique even further. A second concrete example is to compare the institutional responses to violence.
Okay, how so?
Show how settler leadership condemns these fringe acts and contrast that with the institutional financial support for terrorism on the other side. This highlights the asymmetry in the media's framing without having to deny that isolated incidents occur.
I want to explore why that structural comparison is so much more persuasive than just arguing about the number. Like, if we are just arguing about whether 50 people or 500 people committed a crime, we are still trapped in the opponent's framing. But by bringing in the institutional response, what exactly is the writer proving to the audience?
They are proving that the violence is an aberration, not a culture.
Ah, right.
If the leadership representing these 500,000 citizens actively denounces rogue violence and cooperates with law enforcement, it demonstrates that the community's structural foundation is lawful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when the media attempts to paint the entire demographic as violent, yet ignores the leadership's condemnation, the media's bad faith becomes blindingly obvious. You aren't just saying they are biased, you are exposing the structural flaw in their premise.
That's incredibly strong. So, if we've successfully neutralized the opponent's counterarguments about the citizens, the next logical hurdle the writer faces is the authority of the military establishment itself.
Right.
The script transitions into attacking the highest stakes targets, a former defense minister and an IDF general. Specifically, the material takes issue with a general who described an incident initiated by Israelis at a mosque in the village of Tel as friction.
Yeah.
The script calls these leaders subservient and hypocritical, but I struggle with this. If you attack a general's use of the word friction, a viewer might just think you're splitting hairs over semantics. By calling a respected military figure delusional, do you risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist? Shouldn't the script explain why a general would adopt this narrative?
Well, utilizing quotes from authoritative military leaders without deeply dissecting their context misses a critical opportunity to dismantle the institutional roots of the opposing narrative.
Exactly.
The weakness here is that the script presents the general's quote about the mosque incident merely as proof of the establishment's shamelessness and subservience.
Right, it just attacks their character.
Exactly. Reacting to these quotes purely with outrage fails to deconstruct the underlying logic or political pressures that cause these respected figures to speak this way, making the critique feel superficial.
Because the word friction is incredibly sterile. It sounds like a physics equation, implying two equal surfaces rubbing against each other naturally, which completely removes human agency, intent, and morality from the equation.
Right.
A deliberate provocation isn't friction, but how do we make this critique of their vocabulary feel like a high-stakes political analysis rather than just a grammar lesson?
The suggestion is to methodically deconstruct the establishment quotes to expose the flawed logic, shifting definitions, or external pressures behind them. You attack the root of the consciousness engineering rather than just its symptoms.
What does that look like on screen?
As a concrete example, pause the video entirely on the word friction. Add a segment exploring how the military establishment defines friction versus terrorism.
So instead of just being angry at the general, frame it as an analytical question for the viewer to ponder.
Yes, exactly. Frame it exactly like this. When a general categorizes a provocation at a mosque as friction, but the media frames it as an existential threat equivalent to the murder of soldiers, we must ask who is benefiting from the blurring of these definitions.
That is powerful. That pivots the writer from being an angry commentator to an authoritative political analyst. If we want to take that a step further and look at the external pressures you mentioned, how does the writer explain why a general would adopt this sterile language in the first place? What is the institutional angle?
That is the second concrete example. Suggest a brief analysis of the international or political pressures on the IDF Central Command that might necessitate the specific vocabulary.
Right, because bureaucratic language is never accidental.
Is heavily engineered. Exactly. Why does a general use sanitized language here? What political alliances, international optics, or legal constraints are forcing that vocabulary?
That is a massive perspective shift. Because when you attack a general's character by calling them subservient, you are forcing the audience to choose between trusting a YouTuber's anger or trusting a general's uniform.
And most neutral audiences will inherently defer to the uniform.
Yeah, exactly. But if you bypass their character and attack the mechanisms of their speech, you change the game entirely.
You are teaching the audience how to read the general's teleprompter. You are acknowledging the complexity of their position. If the writer stops to pull back the curtain and says, look, the Central Command is under immense pressure from international observers to demonstrate parity, which results in the invention of words like friction to balance the ledger, the writer demonstrates a deep, sophisticated understanding of how the real world operates.
It dismantles the authority figure without ever having to throw a personal insult. The script stops punching at an immovable wall of institutional authority and instead finds the structural stress points in that wall, the political pressures, the careful vocabulary, and gently taps them until the whole thing crumbles under its own contradiction.
Yeah, and notice how that ties all of our structural feedback together. In the beginning, we moved away from emotional adjectives toward clinical, undeniable data, like the stopwatch.
Right.
Then, we moved away from categorical denial towards steel-manning, taking ownership of the demographic reality of isolated violence. Finally, we moved away from insulting authority figures toward analytically deconstructing the institutional pressures behind their vocabulary.
Every single pivot is about replacing raw heat with illuminating light. We are transforming a defensive posture into a highly sophisticated offensive one. We've laid out 3 high-level structural pivots today to achieve that. First, swapping pure emotional rhetoric for quantifiable, data-driven comparisons.
Right.
Second, steel-manning the issue of isolated violence to protect the broader argument about the 500,000 citizens, which neutralizes the opponent's strongest counterattack. And third, analytically deconstructing the establishment's vocabulary rather than just attacking the general.
The passion driving this script is clearly its greatest asset. You know, the energy is already there.
Oh, absolutely.
These structural changes simply act as the steering wheel, ensuring all that horsepower is directed precisely where it will have the maximum persuasive impact.
Implementing these specific, actionable steps will take this material from being a passionate rally for those who already agree and forge it into an impenetrable, persuasive argument capable of changing the minds of those who don't. We invite the creator to revise the material based on these structural notes and submit it back to the critique for another look. We really look forward to seeing how this evolves.